Good afternoon and welcome to Raising the Roof. I just want to acknowledge that it is the top of the hour, but we will give it maybe just one more minute to have a few additional folks join us, and then we'll get started. Thank you. All right, 1 minute after the top of the hour again. Thank you for your punctuality and for joining us. Good afternoon. I'm Tim Klunt, the Director of Housing and Outreach on LISC's National Rural Team. And our team works with and through approximately 150 partners that are transforming rural communities in more than 2,400 counties across 49 states and Puerto Rico. Welcome to Raising the Roof. Through this webinar series, we seek to share innovations, trends, best practices, and thought leadership from our industry colleagues as we work together to create quality, affordable housing opportunities. We know that communities of color, limited wealth communities, and rural communities are disparately impacted by disasters and can often take longer to recover. Today, we'll learn how fortified construction standards contribute to resilient housing by going beyond typical building codes to deliver superior performance, even during severe weather. All webinar attendees have been muted. However, we welcome your thoughts, reactions, and questions, so please submit them via the chat function. I'll pose as many of them to our speakers as time allows. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague and today's discussion leader. Kendra Pospychalla is the Director of Disaster Solutions at Rural LISC. By providing technical assistance, funding opportunities, and situational awareness, Kendra helps local community-based organizations expand or extend their services to support the entire disaster cycle as they see best for their community. Kendra.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am very excited to have you guys here today. We've been supporting rural communities across the country in their recovery, and replacing affordable housing after a disaster is incredibly difficult. And the disasters, they keep coming and we keep rebuilding. And if you look at what's happening in Louisiana right now is a good example. You know, there are probably, I think last number I saw was 4,000 families still displaced from hurricanes over the past 2 years. And every hurricane season, that number increases and increases. And we have come to a point, I think, in our nation's story where resilient construction isn't a nice to have anymore. We really need to be looking at this seriously. So I'm very excited to have IBHS with us here today and introduce them. First, I'd like to introduce Michael Newman. He is the Senior Director for Law and Public Policy at IBHS. And before joining IBHS, he worked with the U.S. Department of Treasury, where his legal and public policy experience included cybersecurity, natural hazard risk, climate change, mitigation, and insurance regulation. He earned his JD from Columbia University School of Law and has a bachelor's from the University of Pennsylvania. And our other guest is Alexandra Cary. She is the marketing development manager at IBHS, and she provides direct support to communities along the Gulf Coast and the Great Plains states. She previously served as the executive director for Smart Home America and the construction manager for Habitat for Humanity of Baldwin County in Alabama. She is a licensed home builder in Alabama, and has been the past president of the Baldwin County Home Builders Association. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our guests.
Kendra, thank you so much. Tim, thank you so much. We're so happy to be here with you all today to talk about how to make housing more resilient across America in all kinds of communities and all kinds of housing. Alex, can you start sharing our screen? Thank you so much. Next slide. I first want to introduce you to who we are at IBHS. And then Alex is going to talk to you all about our FORTIFIED program. So IBHS is the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. Next slide, please, Alex. We're a 501c3 nonprofit research and risk communications institute. We're fully funded by our members, the property insurance and reinsurance industry. From our research center, which you see in front of you, we're able to recreate severe weather and then at full scale test the resilience of the built environment, the homes where we live and the businesses where we work. We study how to make buildings more resilient to high winds, to wind-driven rain, hail, and wildfire. And then we seek to translate that research into actions like risk communications, wind and wildfire mitigation programs that we're going to talk to you about a little bit more in a bit, and public policy engagement. We focus on the way that weather behaves, what makes homes and businesses vulnerable, and how to make our buildings stronger and safer. We exist to help ensure that the places where people live and learn, work and worship and gather are safe, stable, and as strong as the best science can equip them to be. Can we go to the next slide, please? We're going to take you now inside of our research center. As the video starts, our research...
Sorry.
No worries. Oh, let's try it again. Well, we're having a little bit of a lag here with the video. So I think we can, if it's not working, there we go. This is our research campus in Richburg, South Carolina. We have 90 acres. That is 105 6-foot fans capable of generating 135 mile-per-hour winds. That's a Cat 3 hurricane. We also study hail, as I mentioned before. We've patented new ways to create realistic hailstones that help guide our testing. And we study wildfire. We're the only facility in the world that's capable of studying the way that embers and wind and the built environment interact. And of course, we study rain intrusion and wind. We want to avoid sites like this after storms, and we study in the field as well as in our lab, commercial as well as residential structures. At the end of the day, our researchers are looking to figure out what makes buildings vulnerable, how to make them stronger, so that, again, we can make our homes and our businesses as safe as science can equip them to be. Next slide, please. If you click through once or twice. And there's a reason why we do this. Climate change is reshaping our world, and in particular, severe weather in worrisome ways. We need to adapt. We believe that the damage, disruption, and dislocation all too often associated with natural disasters can be reduced, that much of the suffering associated with severe weather is really actually preventable. By making our buildings more disaster resistant, we can make our families, businesses, and communities more climate resilient. So next slide, please. In our research, what we've learned over the years, and we've been studying wind in particular for since we first started in the 1970s, is that losses follow a very consistent path. Damage follows a very consistent path in wind events. And 90% of losses following catastrophes stem from damage to the roof. If we go to the next slide, please. We see this sequence of damage from our lab and in the field, that you have damage to roof cover, then damage to wall covering, then roof sheathing, then roof structural collapse, then total collapse. This happens over and over and over again. And once you have damage to the roof, water comes in. We've actually learned that when there is damage to the roof cover, 1 inch of rain can result in 9 bathtubs of water coming in through the roof. And with that comes mold, comes deterioration, sometimes becomes total loss of the house. But we're not powerless. Our science has taught us that there are things that we can do to mitigate these risks and make our homes, make our commercial structures more resilient to wind and wind-driven rain. And I'm going to turn things over to Alex to talk to us about what that solution is.
All right, so as Michael mentioned, we do not just do research for research's sake. We have a program, and we have determined ways that we know many times these are very small, very cost-effective ways to make homes and businesses stronger, and that is all come through in our Fortified program. We do have multiple programs. Fortified Home has been around the longest. That's been about 10 years now. We've had folks building to the Fortified Home standard, and we then came out with our Fortified Commercial, which addresses, as you might expect, commercial buildings. And most recently, we had multifamily falling under commercial for quite some time, but as multifamily began to play out, we realized that we really needed a dedicated standard for multifamily residential construction. So out of these 3 standards, we are now covering a bulk of the properties, and we have ways to, again, make these businesses and these homes more resilient to disasters going forward. All of these are focusing on wind. We have 2 different standards for each of these. Fortified Home Hurricane, same for commercial multifamily, which covers the coastal areas, primarily the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic seaboard. And then we also have our high wind program. High wind would basically cover the rest of the country. And then with either of those, we have a hail supplement, which can be added, which is simply the addition of an impact rated roof cover. I'm going to go through just very quickly. There are 3 levels to each of these standards. Each of these levels builds off the other. So you would not be able to achieve the higher levels of Fortified if you had not begun with the roof. Michael mentioned that most claims are roof related, and that is where all of the damage starts. It is the first line of defense in any given wind event, and it is the least inspected. So I've stood in rooms full of code officials and other inspectors and asked how many of them inspect the roof, and many times I will only get single digits of hands raised because there is just not a lot of attention paid to the roof. But we know through our research it is the most important, and so we spend a lot of time on that, and that is where the Fortified program actually begins. Nailing it down with ring shank nails doubles the strength of that roof deck attachment, doing what we call sealing the seams. So sealing those seams in the roof deck keeps the water out if and when the roof cover is lost. And then locking in the edges, because with our research both in the lab and in the field, we see that the edges are particularly vulnerable. And once the roof edge is lost, many times it will be a domino effect and more of the roof cover will go with it, which allows all the more water to come into the home or business, into the structure. In the Fortified Silver level, you have to achieve all of the roof standards. And then we go into what we call damage amplifiers. In hurricane prone areas, we're paying particular attention to windows and doors. We know that when windows and doors are breached, that allows the pressures of the wind to come into the structure. And many times that can do much more catastrophic damage if that's allowed to happen. We also look at, particularly in commercial and multifamily, the exterior walls and finishes. So making sure that those walls are actually impact resistant and can keep debris from coming into the structure and damaging further. And then we also pay particular attention to gables. Gable ends are particularly vulnerable as well. That's a very large area that can be very vulnerable to extreme wind pressures. And so we want to see gable end bracing in these instances. And then anything like a porch or a carport or portico, those types of structures, again, can cause significant damage if they're attached to the structure, because if they are lost, they can create much more damage as they take more of the home with it. And then lastly, we get to the Fortified Gold. You have to get Fortified Roof and Fortified Silver in order to achieve Fortified Gold. And then the additional measures of what we call a continuous load path. So making sure that the roof is tied to the walls and that the walls are tied to each other if it's a double story. And then ultimately that all of that is tied to the ground so that the entire structure is tied into the ground and can better resist the wind loads. Here we also in high wind have the attached structures in the high wind regions.
Alex, if I could jump in here, I want to emphasize that Fortified across all 3 lanes, across Fortified Home, Commercial, and Multifamily, is both a new construction and re-roofing program. What we have found is that it is most cost effective if you have an existing structure that you're looking to retrofit to make it more resilient, to focus on the fortified roof level. Anytime that you're planning on doing a re-roofing job, which happens periodically in the life cycle of a structure, that's an excellent time to consider upgrading to a fortified roof. For new construction, new builds across all three lanes, fortified silver, fortified gold, and fortified roof are all possible.
Thank you, Michael. So one of the more important pieces of fortified, obviously we start with the roof and we're applying the standards, but with that we have a verification of compliance, which is a critical element. And this is where a lot of times fortified will separate from traditional building code inspections. And this is also something that's important because it can be utilized in areas where there is not code enforcement. There are many areas of the country that don't actually have code enforcement. And I will mention that in rural areas, this tends to be in states that don't have a code. This is where there's the most vulnerabilities because many times there is not a code enforcement mechanism. So with that verification for fortified home, we have individuals that go out and actually do the inspections, and they're not just checking boxes. We actually require that there be documentation. So we're having those individuals take photographs of various elements of the various components of the fortified program as they're being implemented. Because once those are covered up and we're not able to see them, we're not going to take it on faith that those things are there. So this is an added benefit of verification that the program standards have been met so that the structure can perform as it was intended and designed. There's 3 simple steps to this. Submitting an application, particularly with a commercial or multifamily, that application is actually available online. That planning during the design phase is particularly important with new construction and existing structures that can be done prior to any re-roofing taking place. Once the application has been made, working with the fortified evaluator, again, with single family, those are individuals. With multifamily, we have a dedicated firm that has been authorized to fulfill those inspection and documentation requirements to verify compliance. And once all of the construction has been completed and the verification has been done throughout, only then will we actually have an audit feature for single family. We do that in-house. For multifamily and commercial, we actually have that engineering firm does that. And only then after verification by us or that firm, we issue a certificate. And with that certificate does come benefits in a growing number of states across the country.
And to emphasize what Alex was saying, the reason why we have this relatively intense verification process is because it gives the building owner, it gives the residents, it gives the insurer, it gives any public sector programs that have supported the construction or the retrofit, and it gives investors the confidence that anything that has a fortified designation has not only been designed, but has been constructed and has been verified as such, and that it really does have that elevated level of resilience. And to emphasize a point Alex made, building codes are disparate around the country. While not every state has modern building codes, and not every state that has building codes enforces them rigorously all over the state, this fortified program with its verification process allows for a consistent level of verification regardless of where the structure is located. So an IBHS fortified structure, whether it's in Alabama or Louisiana or Mississippi or Iowa or North Carolina, built to and verify that it has been built to our standard.
So we do have some, well, I'll take that and move forward to some of our case studies that we have had most recently. The recent hurricane in the past several years, we've had some really significant tests. This one, and I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a delay here. This was actually Hurricane Ida. The development that you just saw was almost complete when Ida hit. That was a fortified development. They had virtually no damage, a little bit of siding damage. and some mechanical damage where they hadn't locked things down just yet. But had there been residents in those structures, they would have been able to come back from evacuation and moved in and been able to continue life. This was a development that was just about a mile away from that other development that was not fortified. It was actually built by the same developer. Many of the residents that are currently now living in that other development that was not damaged came from this development. This development, the entire development now is still closed over a year since Ida went through. So this is what we're talking about, especially with families that are least likely to be able to recover. It is so critical that they are able to stay in their residence or come back from evacuation or out of their storm shelters and be able to continue to operate. With this, this is many times, these are the workforce people. We have had multiple disasters in Port Aransas after Hurricane Harvey. We actually had a mayor, their entire workforce housing was demolished. And this particular community has hundreds on a waiting list waiting to get housing after Hurricane Ida. And so we have, we're not just, it's not just coming from us. We actually have some residents that have lived in fortified homes, have experienced disasters, and have had the benefit of being able to continue to live in their communities where their neighbors were not as fortunate. So we have had that upper left-hand corner. This is actually the lodge at Gulf State Park, which is a Hilton property. They were actually able to house some of their workers after Hurricane Sally that hit the Alabama Gulf Coast, and some of their workers' homes were damaged to the point of them needing to move out, and the lodge was able to house some of their residents. So it really did become a beacon for the community, and they were even able to house some of the recovery workers after Sally hit. We had the lower left there, you'll see a fortified homeowner. He was actually able to house some of his neighbors. He was a beacon in his individual community where he had a fortified roof on an existing home. This was a retrofit, and his neighbors did not have fortified roofs. They lost some roof cover, and they were moving their belongings out after Sally because they had so much water come into their home, and he was able to house some of his neighbors. And then you'll see the other folks there on the screen where they had fortified roofs, and they also had peace of mind when Sally blew through because they knew that their homes were more resilient. Now, I do want to mention and use this opportunity to say that fortified is not disaster proofing anything. We are reducing damage, not eliminating damage. So we do encourage when storms hit, whether it is in an inland area and the high wind areas, folks should go to their storm shelters if a tornado is coming or a severe wind event is coming. In hurricane prone areas, if evacuation orders are issued, we do want fortified homeowners to leave, and the chance of them having a home to come back to is drastically increased. But we do want them to listen to authorities, of course. So we also have some really incredible numbers from some of the builders that also had structures that weathered well in Hurricane Sally. This particular builder had 2,000 fortified homes that he had constructed since 2012. And he ended up having no callbacks by any of the homeowners in those homes after Hurricane Sally. We had 17,000 structures in the path of Sally, and about 95% of them went through relatively unscathed and with no insurance claims whatsoever. And these homeowners are definitely on that list. The other benefit to contractors, really, and this was one that kind of came out of the blue, and this was just after a real severe thunderstorm system that had come through, and there was a number of homes in the area that had roof damage, not fortified homes, but others. And this contractor does thousands of roofs in the coastal Alabama area. And after that storm system, where normally they would expect their phone to start ringing and calls coming in for re-roofing, they actually did not have any calls coming in. And so they felt as a benefit, because now those homeowners are going to be recommending them to others because they did not have damage as expected. So really a success. We're seeing more of these types of testimonials coming in on a regular basis from homeowners and contractors alike. So I'm going to pass it back to Michael to give you a little bit of some numbers as far as the losses.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Whenever Alex and I talk about Fortified, everyone nods their head and they say, yes, that sounds great, love to hear it, but really what's the return on my investment? This is going to cost me money and I have a finite amount of resources. Why should I do this in addition to all the great peace of mind reasons that you just described? And we can't give you specific numbers, right? The costs are going to be dependent based on your project, based on where you are in the country, based on, frankly, the inflationary and supply chain impacts we are all seeing right now. But the way we can describe the benefits, at least, are high level, but I hope they're indicative. What you've got in front of you is some modeling that was done looking at a book of business of multifamily housing buildings around the country. And what catastrophe modeling is a tool, especially for the insurance industry, to help them look into the future and try to figure out what losses might be. That average annual loss is an average of the expected loss in any given year across a whole set of years. And it is a tool. It's not the only thing that is an input into insurance pricing and underwriting by any stretch, but it's a tool used by the industry to help figure out what the losses are, what the risks are, and how to figure out what the right price is for insurance. Fortified is a tool to reduce your risk. And this modeling bears that out. The average annual loss, just to bring this book of business up to Fortified roof. So again, that's the base level of Fortified, would reduce average annual loss according to the modeling by 38% and reduce potential loss severity by 41%. Now, am I saying that you're going to get a 40% discount on your insurance? No, I'm not. But I am saying that this is indicative of a reduction in risk that you, in conjunction with your insurance broker, can bring to your insurers and talk to them about your insurance rates. Next slide, please. We also have some claim studies that have been done based on hurricane activity. This comes from a study that was done of fortified homes within an insurer's book of business in North Carolina following, I think, 5 different hurricanes over a set of years. And it found that fortified homes have 22% less damage on average. Claims are also, there's a 35% less reduction in the chance that there will be a claim, and claims are smaller, substantially smaller on average. In some cases, that might even bring it under the deductible, so an insurance claim doesn't need to be brought. Next slide, please. There was also a different study done following Hurricane Sally, different type of storm, different type of event, but again, seeing reductions in claim rates and reductions in claim amounts. All of this means that we are seeing in the field, as in the lab, that risk is reducing when you're able to bring your structure, your home, your building to Fortified. And that can result in reduced insurance costs. Now, every insurer is going to approach this issue differently, with some exceptions. What you see now is a map, obviously, that sets out different states that have either mandatory or voluntary insurance discounts associated with Fortified, that may have grant programs that can make it easier, ease that financial burden of making an investment in resilience, having things like endorsements where if you have a claim, the endorsement, insurance claim, the endorsement would be to build back better to Fortified rather than the way your roof was before. If you go to our website, generally our website for Fortified, fortifiedhome.org, is a great resource for all sorts of information about Fortified, including the application that Alex mentioned, including the technical standards associated with the program. But the fortifiedhome.org/incentives will have more information in different states as to what's available, what's out there. Even in the absence, though, of any state or local programs around this, again, insurance is a business about pricing risk. When you reduce your risk, you may be able to recognize some savings. So I would encourage you to, if you're thinking about Fortified, to work with your insurance broker, try to figure out what's possible and what that might mean for you in your insurance costs. So with that, I think our slide deck has come to an end. We're really looking forward to any questions you might have and to a discussion with Kendra and Tim.
So just thank you both, Michael and Alex. So just a reminder to our participants, we encourage and welcome your questions and comments. Please share those with me via the chat, and I will pose as many of them as possible. But while we wait for them to start coming in, I'll pose a question to you because this came up in one of your first slides. You spent a fair amount of time talking about Fortified as it relates to hurricanes, tornadoes, or other wind events, but there was mention of fire in the beginning of your presentation. So could you speak to the Fortified standard as it relates to fire?
Yeah,
Whether
sure.
it be a structural fire or maybe even a wildfire.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So here's the funny thing about resilience and natural hazards. There are a lot of them. And aside from building Dr. Evil's underground concrete layer, there is no structure that's going to be resilient across all of the natural perils. Fortified, as Alex mentioned, is a standard that speaks to high wind and wind-driven rain intrusion. I'm very happy to announce that later this month, we are going to be launching a separate new program focused on the wildfire risk called Wildfire Prepared Home. That's going to be focused at the start only in the state of California. The guidance that's part of it, the set of mitigation actions that are a part of it, are certainly applicable anywhere there's wildfire risk, and our website is wildfireprepared.org. I'd encourage anyone who's concerned about that risk to go check it out and see what type the system of mitigation actions that are associated with that program. But to start, after we launch, it is going to be available, focused solely on single-family detached homes in the state of California. I do expect in the coming years for that scope to expand.
I saw Kendra perk up with that because she does a lot of work in rural communities in Northern California, especially those that have been affected by wildfire. So that's a big announcement. Thank you for that. And I see that Keegan dropped the website that Michael referenced into the chat. Again, wildfireprepared.org. Let's see, okay, there's a question coming in. Are there particular building or housing types that are more vulnerable to disasters?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So I didn't mention this during our presentation, but we do know that manufactured housing is particularly vulnerable. I think we all are aware that we see those types of damages on the news all the time, where entire mobile manufactured home communities are often super vulnerable and in some cases destroyed after tornado events and hurricane events and any wind events. We can and we do have the ability to fortify a manufactured home. There are some very specific requirements for that. It does need to be a HUD manufactured zone 3 that was manufactured after 1995, and it does need to be on a permanent foundation, but that is something that we can fortify. We would want to be involved pretty early on. That can be done to an existing, if it is anchored, we can get to fortified roof, but certainly a new structure, if it's being set on a permanent foundation, can be fortified, and we would encourage that. The soil anchors that are traditionally used, we would not allow, and those do tend to have specific vulnerabilities from an engineering standpoint. So I would say those are probably the most, as well as homes that are on what we call a dry stack foundation. So that, in other words, that they are not anchored to the ground. Those can also be particularly vulnerable, and in coastal areas, we do see quite a bit of that.
Another question, I will read it, and then I think I'm going to expand on it just a little bit. The question being, does anyone participate in these programs in Washington State or Oregon? So I have you respond to that, but then maybe you could say a few more words about, um, that Fortified is a standard that engages or requires the participation of independent contractors and independent inspectors or evaluators. So maybe you could just say a few more words about that so that as our partners are listening, they know how they would even go about maybe finding a contractor or a roofer who's well-versed with Fortified, and then also an independent inspector to confirm the standard.
Sure. So I'll jump in on the Washington, Oregon front first. I think we have potentially one in either one of those states, although I don't remember which right now. And I did a presentation at a Habitat International conference most recently, and there was somebody that was very interested in being the first in one of those states. So we don't have a lot going on there, but certainly I think that there's a potential challenge to accept there. Now, as far as the evaluations, the certification for contractors and evaluators, we do have a website where you can actually look to find some contractors that might be available in your community. The fortifiedhome.org website, you can look for professionals that have been trained and certified on that page. So there may be in some of your communities contractors that have been trained and certified already. For those communities that do not, we do have our trainings are now online and they're very accessible. So for example, the roofer training, and this would all be for the fortified home for the single family. We're continuing to work on the multifamily, and that is a little bit different of a program process. But for single family, we have, for example, the roofing trainings are available online. They're pretty minimal in cost. So a roofer can take the training for $100 and get certified for an additional $50. We also have those available in Spanish. We know that a large percentage of the workforce there, that is something that we have seen some folks take advantage of. So we do not have the exam in Spanish, but we do have the training in Spanish. We also have our Fortified WISE evaluator certification also online. It is all of our trainings are broken into modules, so they can be done at self-paced, and so it's pretty accessible to just about anybody. And then for the evaluators, we do not necessarily have a wide variety of evaluators in many states. We do have a national firm that we work with that can service many of those communities, even though we may not have anyone on the listing. We do have the ability and that resource available to be able to stand up somebody in those communities within very short notice if we are aware that there is a need there. We also are looking for more. So if any of you out there know a home inspector or a energy rater or a code official or a contractor that might be interested in participating, we are always on the lookout for new candidates who might be interested in getting trained and then in working in their communities to create more fortified.
And if I can add to what Alex said, I love the question about Oregon and Washington because it's a different region of the country than the Southeast. And I think that many of us who are kind of in this disaster recovery, resilience space oftentimes focus on the hurricane-prone regions. The fact is, wind is wind is wind, that there are significant wind events that damage homes, that upend lives, that cause destruction and dislocation and damage all over the country, whether it's straight line winds, derechos, tornadoes. We certainly I guess it was December, we saw the terrible tornado outbreak in the middle of the country. This is a problem in pretty much every state in the nation. And Fortified is a solution that is applicable in every state in the nation. So the fact that we have more fortified structures in Alabama than any other state, that other states you often hear IBHS talk about are Louisiana and North Carolina and Florida. Don't let that dissuade you if you're from a different region of the country looking for solutions for wind, because this really is applicable. And as Alex mentioned at the outset, there is really two different types of fortified standards, if you will. There's a focus on hurricanes. There's a focus on what we call high wind, that's more inland regions. So it's not a one-size-fits-all program. It is geared to be applicable to what is appropriate to up your level of resilience, no matter where you are in the country.
Thank you for that. I think, Kendra, I'll pose this question to you. It's a meaty one. How's that? Is there any guidance on steps we can take to prepare our buildings or help our wider community be better prepared for disasters? Are there any best practices for communications, community engagement, and/or resident education you can share? So I think if I read into this question, we've been spending a lot of time talking about the structure, right? How to prepare a structure. And I think this question is maybe getting at what can we do as a community to better prepare for a disaster and then know how to respond to one.
Yeah, I think there's, I would say, two avenues. I would think about residents and the public at large. If you want to communicate to them, it's important to understand that preparedness as a matter of behavior change. And so, and even things like evacuations during the moment, that this is all, it takes repetition. And people, our behaviors are based so much off of what we see culturally around us. So if you see when a fire alarm goes off, we look at everyone else's reactions before we actually move, as is shown in science. So I would say be part of that culture of preparedness, communicate this multiple times. I think on average, people need to hear things at least 3 times before they start to move. So be another voice in that and communicate this. If you have multifamily housing and residents, like in any materials or opportunities you have to communicate this in your community, definitely do it. So there's that angle of communicating to the public, and don't be alarmist. It only backfires on you. Just be real and consistent. But then the other side is, like, as an affordable housing organization, participating at the community level and advocating, I think, is a big part. And so post-disaster, they have groups like long-term recovery groups. You also have VOADs, which are voluntary organizations active in disaster. I advocate being part of those and bringing your expertise and advocating for things like fortified and resilient construction in the recovery process, as well as in things like the state action plans and recovery plans, advocating for the role of affordable housing and resilient construction in those, because a lot of times those get missed. So that would be my thoughts on community engagement, I guess.
Thank you. Let's see. Okay. Are there proxies we can use to better understand the physical vulnerability of our existing building or housing stock?
I'm going to defer to Alex.
Yeah, so I think building codes, I'm going to start with actually building codes and new construction first, and then sort of back into that answer. We know that modern building codes work. We see regularly how newer construction does perform better in disasters. So the existing housing stock is certainly more vulnerable, especially the older it is, tends to be more vulnerable. So I think starting with the roof is always the best way. There's a huge, like Michael said earlier, there's a great opportunity for existing homes or even repair programs. I know we've had some great successes with some of our nonprofit partners that have repair programs that do focus on the roof, and that is a really optimal time to be able to apply for the fortified standards and get that roof strengthened because of that amount of damage that tends to happen, especially to existing homes, especially to the roof. So I think that's sort of the low-hanging fruit in that area with existing housing stock. I hope that answers your question adequately.
And I had to turn off my video because of internet issues, but I want to direct folks to an online tool. It's www.inspecttoprotect.org. It's hosted by an organization called Flash that we work with. And inspecttoprotect.org, you can put in your address or zip code and find out what the code is in your community. It's a really great tool. A lot of social science research has suggested that people just assume, well, of course I have a strong building code, and that's not always the case. So that's a really great resource, and depending on what you learn, that may well be, as Alex pointed out, that may well be a proxy for needing to improve upon your resilience. And I should add that FORTIFIED is a beyond code program. That means what we require, while there are some building codes that approach it, it is different and intentionally beyond where even the most modern building codes are right now. So that FORTIFIED, even if you live in a place with a modern and strongly enforced code, that's really good. If you want to go beyond that, FORTIFIED remains a tool at your disposal.
I'll share, I think, really more of a comment than a question, but I know this will also get Kendra's head nodding up and down. Community-wide mitigation, this is just a comment again from an attendee. Community-wide mitigation strategies and projects can help local entities be better protected, or at least have reduced risk for higher impacts from disasters. And again, I think it's getting back to that community preparedness, community connectedness, and just knowing what to do if and when a natural disaster strikes.
I agree with that, Tim. I will say it's not necessarily applicable for all hazards in the same way, right? For the flood hazard, there are things that individual property owners can do, and there are things that communities need to do. In the wildfire hazard, same deal. For wind, the way we mitigate wind risk is by structure basis. And as we're thinking about public policies and programs and community programs to support resilience to high winds and storms, we have to keep in mind that sometimes we do really need to do this on a structure by structure way. And building codes are a great tool in the toolbox. Grant programs are great tools. Tax incentives are great tools. But sometimes, yes, absolutely, community resilience and community mitigation actions are incredibly important for a large number of hazards. But that's just unfortunately not always the case.
Thank you. All right, I'll pause here to just see if there's one or two more questions coming in via the chat. But I will also see if there are any parting remarks that any of our presenters would like to make, or a closing statement, Kendra?
I just thank Michael and Alex so much for being here. I think this, like I said, is an incredibly important thing, especially at this moment in time. And I really hope everyone in our network does start considering how they can make this happen in their projects. And I will say, Tim and I, from a rural LISC perspective, have been chatting about ways and exploring ways that we can't support folks in our network who are trying to make this happen with their projects and in their communities too. But again, thank you guys so much. And if any of our attendees have more questions or interest, by all means, feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, and I can't stress enough that, especially to those attendees who are part of the Rural LISC Partner Network, that Kendra is a tremendous technical resource to all of you as you think about how to better prepare for and respond to disaster, and thinking about the intersection of disaster solutions and housing. Absolutely, please consider us a resource. So with that, Kendra, Michael, Alex, thank you for sharing your knowledge and your insights on this timely and increasingly important topic. And I also want to give a special thank you to Keegan McChesney for his behind the scenes work to make sure that the webinar came off smoothly. And lastly, thanks to our attendees for joining this installment of Raising the Roof. If you have ideas or suggestions for future topics, we'd love to hear them. You can email Keegan McChesney. His address is on the screen. So again, thank you for your participation, both to our participants and our attendees, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.